this week, while some in the Senate are working to borrow yet another $95 billion, the Congressional Budget Office, also known as the CBO, released a new forecast which indicates that the federal government's national debt is set to reach a massive $54 trillion by 2034. That's just 10 years away. That comes to about an extra $1 trillion every 6 months. That additional $19 trillion that we're talking about in debt will be partially due to higher interest expenses on our already out of control debt. But what will result from the economic damage from this unchecked spending? These are questions that need answers. And joining me now to discuss this is Joel Griffith. He's a research fellow in the Thomas A. Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Joel, welcome back to Washington Watch. Great to have you.
Hey, really glad to be on the show tonight. Thanks.
Well, listen, let's $54 trillion. I mean, that is even difficult to say. I can't even fathom the amount of money we're talking about here in just 10 more years, $54 trillion. Your reaction to those numbers?
It's absolutely astounding. And you're right, these numbers are so mind-boggling. I try to break it down per family. And if you look at what we owe right now per family in terms of the debt, we owe $400,000 per family in federal debt. We're expected to add another $250,000 per family over the next 10 years. And you mentioned the interest payments. Yes, this is huge. We're already paying around $10,000 per family per year just on the interest on the federal debt. And that is going to nearly double to close to $20,000 per family per year just on the interest component of the national debt over the next decade. And to keep that in perspective as well, we're already spending right now on the interest about what we spend on the entirety of our national defense budget. And within 10 years, the new estimates are that we might be spending close to twice every year just on the interest relative to what we're spending on our military. This is unsustainable.
It's unsustainable. It's just absolutely frightening to consider where we are headed if we don't get this thing right. And I do want to go down that path with you to discuss that particular aspect of this whole argument. But before we get to that, yesterday, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen was on Capitol Hill and had this exchange. I want you to see it and get your reaction.
If we don't course correct, the federal deficit may very well reach a point where no one's willing to take on our government-issued debt. Is that a possibility?
It could, in an extreme case, be a possibility. I see no sign of that now. But of course, we need to stay on a fiscally sustainable path.
All right, I want to get your reaction to this, but particularly the last comment. She said we need to stay on a fiscally sustainable path, as you just mentioned a while ago. Are we on that path right now?
You know, there's two major problems with what Janet Yellen said, and there's no excuse for it given her position of power and her education. Number one, by suggesting that we need to stay on a sustainable path, she's saying we're on one right now. Well, that is absolutely ludicrous. We have been off that path for several years. And it didn't start with President Biden. The tail end of the President Trump's term was absolutely outrageous as well in terms of the debt we are taking on. We are already on the path to unsustainability. But number two, she said that she sees no sign of investor demand drawing up for our federal debt. That is outright ludicrous. I actually took a look at the numbers right today, earlier on. We actually have seen a drop off in the amount of federal debt that foreign investors own. They've been selling our debt. And get this, over the last 2.5 years, foreign investors have only been willing to purchase about 1 penny of every new dollar of federal debt that we've taken on. In years past, foreign investors bought about 1/3 of our federal debt. And when we have foreign demand for debt, that actually helps us because it keeps those interest rates down. What we see right now with investor demand drawing up for that debt, that means that the federal government has to pay more to those who will lend us money. And when you see interest rates on our federal debt rise, Well, that means that private capital, they have to compete with higher rates as well. And that trickles down directly to us as consumers. It means we end up paying more for our auto loans, credit cards, and our home mortgage. And just one more point on that. If we see overall interest rates long term increase by just 1 percentage point because of this explosion of federal debt, think about what that does to your mortgage payment. A 1% interest rate hike on your mortgage means around $400 a month extra in interest for your home.
Wow. All right. So, from my time in Congress, one of the big questions that many of us ask over and over and over, and I guess really no one really knows the answer to this, but we've got to be getting closer. Is there a line in the sand? Is there a point in which we absolutely must change course, or we are headed to an economic collapse, a total disaster? At what point do we get to that edge that we're at the point of no return?
Well, there are multiple ways this can pan out. None of the scenarios are good. We could end up with a long-term relative decline in our prosperity. If you look at us versus Western Europe, for instance, which have much larger governments, typical middle-class families aren't doing as well. Typical middle-class family, for instance, here earns about $12,000 more per year than in Germany, for instance. That would be one avenue. That's not great. But you could also see something that similar to happened in Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain several years ago, where they saw the bottom drop out of their economy with soaring interest rates, soaring inflation, and unemployment going to close to 20% in some of those countries. And then, of course, you have the very extreme examples of governments that get far too large and a central bank that is out of control. Look at places in South America like Argentina and Venezuela, where inflation isn't just 5 or 6% a year, which is quite high. It's sometimes in the triple digits every year. None of these scenarios are good, and we need to have Congress people get on the ball, address these problems, and recognize we are in dire straits if we do not make changes now.
Wow. Joel Griffith from the Heritage Foundation, thank you for all the incredible work that you do and all your team over there. We are greatly appreciative. Thank you for joining us on Washington Watch this evening.
Thanks for having me this evening.